So I'm excited to present our research. We did a comparative study of 5 different two-factor authentication methods. So I'm grateful for Simon. He explained U2F really well. So then you'll understand that in my presentation. So passwords, they're everywhere, but this audience knows that they're just simply not enough. There's so much evidence that shows the weakness of passwords. And so many organizations have turned to two-factor authentication as a means of augmenting that weak password. Which two-factor, you have to have 2 of these 3 categories. So there's something you know, which is typically a password, something you have, such as a phone or a U2F device, and something you are, so biometrics, such as a Face ID or a fingerprint. So in particular, the 5 two-factor authentication methods that we studied were the SMS message, TOTP, or the time-based one-time password, pre-generated codes, push notifications, and the U2F security keys. So each of these 5, they're 5 of the most common second factors, and they all fall into the something you have category. So the first image you'll see is paper. That represents the pre-generated codes. You can also store those codes on your computer or on a thumb drive, but in our study we printed those codes. The phone is used for the SMS messages, the push notifications, and the TOTP. And then for the U2F device, we studied the YubiKey in particular. So our goal was to perform a comparative usability study of these 5 2FA methods. And we built on a lot of great previous work. So about a decade ago, there were a group of 2FA banking studies that mostly took place in the UK. And they had mostly negative results. And part of that was maybe because it was a decade ago. But that's it was a good thing for us to base on. Then there have been recently some more studies. Dutson et al. Studied the setup of security keys on Google, and they made some recommendations that Google used and implemented and improved their design. The study that's most similar to ours is Ismail et al. They set up 4 of the 5 two-factor authentication methods that we're studying on Google. And they, interestingly, we found the same order of which were the most usable and which were the least usable for our SUS scores. But they had more negative results than we found. And part of that may be due to the fact that in between their study and our study, Google did make some changes to that setup process. So that's encouraging. And finally, there have been some studies on the day-to-day usability of security keys, including the talk that you just heard about. So building on these previous studies, we designed a study to compare 5 factors across a single application. And using a single application helps reduce some of the confounding factors that comes when you're trying to compare one second factor on one application with another on a totally different application. This also allowed us to gather timing data so we could see how long it took the users to authenticate with their second factor. The second thing we did for our study is we examined the setup and day-to-day usability independently, which is something that Reynolds et al. Did when studying YubiKey and the same way that Simon did in the talk we just heard. This helps avoid bias. If a user has a really poor setup experience, they're likely going to rate the day-to-day usability much lower. So we have 2 parts, the 2 parts to our study. The first, we did a 2-week between subject usability study where each group was assigned a different second factor, and they authenticated that over the period of 2 weeks. The second part was a within subjects setup study where every participant set up each of the 5 authentication methods. So I'll go over the 2-week study first, and then I'll talk about what we learned through the setup study. We recruited 72 participants, and we divided them into 6 groups, one for each of the second factors, and then another control group which used only passwords to authenticate. And we created a simulated online banking website, and then over the course of 2 weeks, we had them complete 12 banking tasks, and they could complete no more than 1 task a day. During the initial meeting, we set up the second factor with them, again, so that they would not have to have a poor or good experience with that could bias our results. And then after the 2-week period, we had an exit interview where we asked a series of open-ended questions. We have two sorts of findings. Our quantitative findings come from timing data and SUS scores that we gathered, and our qualitative data comes from the themes that we identified as a part of those exit interviews. So there was quite a bit of variance in the timing data, but also a lot of overlap. So the fastest second factor by far was the U2F device, which had a median time of about 9 seconds. And the longest was the printed codes, which was also really close to the SMS messaging. One thing to note, this is the time that the time started after user entered their password, and the time ended after they authenticated with the second factor. So we don't know if this time includes time it may have taken someone to go get their second factor if they didn't have it immediately on them. Another thing that we looked at was individual learnability within timing. So we wanted to know, as users become more familiar with this particular second factor, will it increase the speed with which they can authenticate? And this was true in the case of push notifications and U2F. So that's also encouraging to know. Maybe if at first a user feels like it takes too long, they can speed up with a system if they weren't familiar with it at first as they learn more about the system. Here are our SUS scores, which there was a lot of variance as well. Obviously, passwords performed the best with a median score of 95, which is as we expected. After that, the best performing second factor was TOTP, which had a median score of about 88. And the lowest two were the SMS and the U2F. So something that's interesting about this, you'll notice in the last slide, U2F had the fastest time to authenticate, but it had the lowest SUS score, median SUS score. So that shows that timing is not necessarily the thing that users care most about when it comes to the usability of second factors. Our qualitative results we had two coders code each interview and identify common themes, which I'll talk about now. The first theme is the trade-off between security and inconvenience. So this participant said, in my opinion, it may be a little obsessive for everything, but for banking, it's something that I actually do want some authentication. So 29% of people we surveyed said security was definitely worth the inconvenience cost. And another 36% said it would depend on the importance of the account. So that's 65% of users who said, at least in some circumstances, we want 2FA, which is encouraging. Another theme we identified was that the availability of second factor devices. This participant said, honestly, once I'm home, I kind of just set my phone down and forget where I put it sometimes. So that was a little bit hard. I needed to go find my phone and pull up the app. And 35% of our users mentioned at least once not having their second factor device immediately available. This could be more common among personal users, which is the setting that we tested this in. Because maybe for work, many people are required to have a second factor device in order to do their work, whether a smart card or a U2F device, whereas at home, people might not want to have that second factor on them all the time. And then we identified, as has been talked about previously in this conference, that many participants just feel like they're not a target. This participant said, I mean, you hear a lot about stuff being broken into. I just don't think I have anything that people would want to take from me. So I think that's why I haven't been very worried about it. So it's true that the average user is not going to be targeted by a targeted phishing attack, but hackers are happy to have anyone's credentials, whether they're a billionaire or not. So this is just more evidence that we need to educate users on the dangers of account compromise. But all in all, we were surprised and encouraged and thought that on the most part, the day-to-day usability was pretty good. So for each of those 5 SUS scores, the median score was higher than what's considered average, which is a score of 68 or 70. So we were really encouraged by that. We do have a few limitations. So we studied a university population, and that is not representative of all population. Also, using a simulated banking environment instead of a real banking environment may have changed the way that the users used 2FA. We also recognize that it would have been different if we had used a social media environment or an environment where users may not have felt 2FA was as important. In the real world, many organizations offer a Remember Me option, which we did not offer because we wanted users to authenticate on every attempt. And so in that way, our study is different than how 2FA might work in the wild. So we had really encouraging results for our day-to-day study, and we wanted to then see, are there major setup hurdles that might prevent someone from using the fairly good day-to-day usability of these methods. For our setup study, we recruited 30 participants, and we used counterbalancing to account for ordering effects as each participant went through each of the 5 methods. We used Google as kind of a case study. We didn't want to study one provider in particular, but Google has been known to have relatively good security and usability, and so we wanted to just study them as an example of can setup be implemented well. So we measured timing data for how long it took each participant to set up, and the setup time varied much more than the day-to-day authentication time, with TOTP being the highest, a median setup time of 84 seconds, over a minute. The codes, you might notice, is very, very small. That's because all you have to do is click a button and those codes are automatically generated for you. So we did not include in this timing data the time it would have took for participants to print out these codes or store them somewhere on a device, because that would vary widely based on what the participant wanted to do or even what kind of printer that they had. So the timing data differed. We also, instead of doing a SUS score to measure each of the 5 for the setup, we chose to use the single ease question instead, which is a single question measuring perceived usability on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being very difficult and 7 very easy. And we did this so that we could avoid survey fatigue, since each participant had to measure 5 different second factors. Interestingly, TOTP, which had the highest SUS score, had the lowest SEQ score here. So this is something that can show us if we can get past a poor setup for TOTP, then day-to-day usability can be much higher and a great experience for many users. But even so, we were surprised that in general, for every one of the 5 factors, there were more positive than negative scores for the SEQ score. And for U2F and TOTP, which had those 2-1, which is the worst score on the bottom, we think that those poor scores might be explained by the setup failures, which occurred twice with TOTP and twice for U2F. So for the TOTP, these errors came when a participant attempted to scan a QR code with their camera app, rather than first downloading the Google Authenticator app. So the instructions did say you must download the Authenticator app before you scan this code, but a lot of participants don't read. As soon as they see a QR code, they just wanted to scan that. And for the U2F, the failures both occurred when there's a pop-up permission that comes up and asks if Google can see the make and model of the U2F device. But because participants were unfamiliar with the U2F device, they had to look at the device to touch the button, and so they missed the pop-up on the screen and then were unaware of how to proceed. So both of these failures were probably avoidable with a different setup design, and so we do make some recommendations for Google in our paper, which you can read. All in all, again, we were pleasantly surprised with how, in general, the users found the setup usability to be. Again, it was a university population. Another thing, we did not intend to study Google's specific implementation, but because we chose Google as our case study, their implementation obviously had an effect on our results. We did not want, our final limitation, we did not want participants to give us personal information, so we provided them with a phone, which may have increased the time that the setup took, because they were unfamiliar with how the phone worked. If it was an Android phone, if they had an iOS, some of them were not as familiar, and they were also unfamiliar with the phone number. So in conclusion, our major takeaways, the biggest one is that well-implemented 2FA methods may be used and set up without major difficulty, at least for university populations or similar populations. So this represents progress, compared to many earlier studies which have had kind of some mixed results. And so I think that as a community, we're kind of ready to move on to other populations. Yesterday, we talked about the elderly and the visually impaired and other groups and test how two-factor authentication is usable enough for these groups. We found that home users might not always have access to their second-factor devices. We found that users differentiate quite a bit between low and high value accounts. We found that for U2F and TOTP, that time to authenticate decreases as familiarity with the methods increases. And finally, we found that faster authentication doesn't necessarily mean higher usability. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned SUS score. Could you explain what that is?
Yes, so that's the standard usability. It's a questionnaire which has 10 questions, and it's a really good standard way to measure perceived usability. So for example, for our YubiKey, for its day-to-day usability, we got a score of 73, which happened to be the exact same score that Simon got in this last paper. So it's fairly consistent as standard usability questionnaire.
And when you created that banking app, was that running in the browser? Oh, the simulated banking environment?
Yeah, so we hosted it online, so participants would go to a website. It looks like a banking app. You can make transfers and you can make deposits, but it was fake money.
Right.
Yeah, but it was just like a normal website.
You didn't attempt to test that in an application?
We didn't use an app. We did test, one thing we did do for the SUS scores, we had one SUS score for the banking website and another SUS score for the second factor, and that was to mitigate if somebody had a bad experience with the usability of the website, that they would hopefully put that in the first SUS questionnaire.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, this is Olabode Nisha from Duo Security. I just want to say thank you for this research. It's really interesting to someone who works at a two-factor authentication company. One thing I was wondering is if you happen to, before separating individuals into these different factor methods, did you ask what method they had used in the past and what they're familiar with? And then the second question is, did you kind of measure retry rates or failure rates as time progressed as people use these factor methods?
Yes, so that's a great question. We did not ask if they had used two-factor authentication before, which is another limitation of our study. That would be a really great thing to do in a future study. And could you repeat your second question again?
The second question was, like, you talked to how, in terms of push and U2F, people's time to authenticate decreased as time went on. And I was wondering if, because you kind of owned the server side, did you check to see if people's failure rates also decreased in terms of, especially like entering codes or timeouts as time went on?
Yeah, we did not check that. That would be another good thing to look at in the future. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, this is a very interesting study, and thank you for the work and presentation and the use of standard measures. So we did a study that we only presented 2 days ago, so obviously it could not have influenced your work, of two-factor with older people, and we found with a population of active retirees, it took them 52 minutes on average to deal with two-factor authentication. So, and then, I mean, some of these people had, you know, general computer skills, but what they also had was a more accurate perception of risk because they were really afraid of access to their bank. And so some of the work that was presented earlier, so actually by the person behind me in line, talked about measuring risk perception and how that might drive adoption. So so I'm going to leave that question to her. But the different populations have, in our experience, wildly different experiences. I mean, literally it was like a 3-hour interview with an hour of that getting the two-factor set up. So I think, yes, we've got to talk about people who are older, people who have cognitive limits, people who have physical limits and visualization. So I encourage your...
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Hi, I'm Sarah Pierman from Carnegie Mellon. Thank you for your talk. I think there are a lot of parallels between our work here. One thing I was curious about is both of us mentioned that people had trouble with risk assessment, understanding how account compromise works and how likely they are to experience it. And we both mentioned that users should be educated more about that. I was wondering if you had any ideas about how we do that, because I think it's a really, a problem that's really resistant to any interventions I can think of because of just how humans assess risk.
That's
Any ideas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I know there's been some previous work talking about the effectiveness of videos, kind of like scaring users into adopting 2FA, and I don't know if that's the best way. We did recently a study of adopting Duo 2FA at our university and found a similar thing, that just many users felt like they had no idea why they had to adopt this and didn't feel like their account was at risk. And so I think our university has tried to put out some messaging that kind of explains why, but we haven't studied how effective that's been. Or I wish there was a silver bullet, but that's a question I ask myself as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that. I think it's really tough.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if we can thank again all the speakers.